The fellowship hall of the small church in Shreveport, Louisiana, was alive with muted sounds. Folding chairs scraped against the polished wooden floor as people shuffled to find their seats, while soft murmurs filled the air, a mix of casual greetings, whispered speculations, and the occasional laugh. Normally, this space was filled with the aroma of potluck dishes or the sound of hymns during Bible study. But tonight, the room carried a different energy, one laced with anticipation and a touch of unease. At the front of the hall stood Donald Trump, his larger-than-life presence contrasting with the modest simplicity of the setting. His usual bravado seemed tempered, his movements measured, as if aware of the weight of the moment. The familiar orange hue of his complexion and his characteristic hand gestures were present, but his voice carried an unfamiliar note, something between solemnity and restrained determination. His words, though forceful, were slower, as if he were carefully choosing each one. In the middle of the crowd, an 8-year-old girl named Lily sat quietly on one of the folding chairs, her small hands clutching a worn, leather-bound Bible that had once belonged to her late grandmother. The Bible, with its faded gold lettering and delicate, dog-eared pages, was a treasure that Lily rarely brought out in public. But tonight felt important, and she wanted to feel her grandmother's presence with her. Her Sunday dress, a soft blue with a white collar, was immaculately pressed, and her neatly tied braids framed a face marked by seriousness beyond her years. Lily's eyes rarely left the figure at the front of the room. She watched Trump with an intensity that belied her age, her young mind working over the words she had practiced in her head. She had a question to ask, one that felt too big for someone her size but one that she knew she had to voice. Her heart raced, a nervous energy bubbling within her, but her small frame remained still. Her father sat beside her, his large hand resting protectively on her shoulder, a quiet reassurance that she drew strength from. Around her, the audience was a mix of faces, some eager, some skeptical, and others simply curious. But Lily felt a strange calm amidst the buzz, as if the noise around her had dulled, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat and the echo of the words she was preparing to speak. She didn't yet know if her question would change anything or even if it would be heard in the way she intended, but she felt her grandmother's Bible warm in her hands, and that was enough. For now, she waited, her young heart steadying itself against the weight of the moment. As the room settled, Donald Trump paused, letting his words hang in the air. The weight of his presence seemed to draw everyone's focus, and the soft rustle of movement ceased. Lily knew her moment had come. Her small hand trembled slightly as she raised it, the Bible still clutched against her chest. At first, Trump didn't notice her. His gaze swept the room, addressing the larger audience. But then a few murmurs from the crowd directed his attention to the young girl. He paused, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "You there," he said, pointing toward her with one of his signature gestures. "You've got something to say?" All eyes turned to Lily, and a hush fell over the room. Her father gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, silently encouraging her. Taking a deep breath, she stood on her tiptoes to steady herself, her voice clear but soft. "Mr. Trump," she began, her tone carrying the earnestness of someone far older than her 8 years, "why do people sometimes treat each other so badly, even when they know it hurts?" The room seemed to hold its collective breath. A question like that, coming from such a young child, carried a gravity that silenced even the most jaded listeners. Lily's wide brown eyes looked up at him, her expression a mix of innocence and determination. It was as if she weren't just asking him, but everyone in the room. Trump's face softened for a moment, a flicker of something genuine crossing his features. He leaned forward slightly, as if to better hear her. "That's a big question," he said, his voice uncharacteristically measured. "A really big question." The crowd watched intently, waiting to see how he would answer. Lily didn't flinch under the weight of his gaze, her hands gripping the Bible tighter. Trump continued, his tone shifting to one of careful thought. "Sometimes, people hurt others because they're scared, or because they don't understand. And sometimes, well, sometimes they've been hurt themselves and don't know how to deal with it." He paused, glancing briefly at the crowd before returning his attention to Lily. "But it's brave to ask a question like that. It shows you care, and caring is the first step to making things better." Lily nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, but her question still lingered like an open wound. After a beat, she spoke again, her voice even softer this time. "Do you think we can fix it?" Trump straightened, his expression shifting back to his usual confidence. "I think we can try," he said, his voice firmer now. "And it starts with people like you, asking the right questions and holding people like me accountable." A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing. Lily sat back down, her cheeks flushed but her heart lighter. Her father smiled at her, pride evident in his eyes. For Lily, it wasn't the perfect answer, but it was enough. She felt her grandmother's Bible warm in her lap, as if affirming that sometimes, just asking the question was a step toward the answer. As the applause subsided, a strange stillness settled over the room. For a moment, Donald Trump didn't respond with his usual bravado. Instead, his expression turned uncharacteristically introspective, his sharp blue eyes briefly flickering with something deeper, something vulnerable. He cleared his throat and looked at Lily again, this time with an unusual softness. "You know," he began, his voice quieter now, "when I was young, my mother used to say that kindness was the most powerful thing in the world. She'd tell me that no matter how much you build, how much you win, if you lose your kindness, you lose everything." The crowd grew silent again, captivated by the unexpected sincerity in his tone. Trump glanced down, as if searching for the right words. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, the candor in his voice startling to everyone in the room. "There were times I let anger, or pride, get in the way. Times I hurt people, even if I didn't mean to." His gaze lifted, meeting Lily's with an earnestness that seemed almost unguarded. "But questions like yours, little girl, questions that come from a place of love, they remind people like me of what's really important. They make us stop and think." Lily's eyes stayed locked on his, her expression a mix of curiosity and empathy. The crowd exchanged murmurs, surprised by the vulnerability in Trump's words. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to Lily. "You asked if we can fix it," he said, his voice growing firmer. "And the truth is, I don't have all the answers. But I believe in people, people like you, who have the courage to speak up and challenge the way things are." Trump straightened, his usual commanding presence returning. "It's not just leaders who can make a difference. It's everyone in this room. It's in the way we treat each other, the choices we make every day." The applause began again, this time stronger and more heartfelt. Lily sat quietly, her cheeks glowing with pride but her thoughts still racing. She hadn't expected her question to lead to such an emotional response, let alone stir something so raw in a man known for his defiance. Trump raised his hand, signaling for silence as he looked at Lily one last time. "Thank you for asking that question," he said, his voice resonating with finality. "Don't ever stop asking the tough ones. They're what make us better." The room erupted into applause, but Lily barely noticed. Her father squeezed her shoulder, his own pride evident. She felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and hope. As the noise of the crowd filled the room, she clutched the Bible tightly to her chest, whispering a quiet prayer that her small voice had truly made a difference. Trump turned back to the podium, his usual confidence returning, but there was a new depth in his demeanor, a subtle but unmistakable shift, as if Lily's question had planted a seed he hadn't expected. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that even a room as grand and divided as this could hold a glimmer of unity, sparked by the courage of a little girl with a big question. Donald Trump paused, his hands resting on the edges of the podium as he glanced over the crowd. The applause from his previous remarks had faded into an expectant silence. His demeanor shifted again, less commanding, more reflective. "When I was younger," he began, his voice steady but quieter than usual, "I learned a hard lesson about loss. It was a long time ago, but it still stays with me." He took a breath, his gaze unfocused, as though seeing a memory from years past. "My older brother, Fred, was a great guy. Smart, charming, and funny. He had this way of lighting up a room, making everyone feel special. But life wasn't always kind to him, and he struggled with things I didn't fully understand at the time. I was so focused on my own goals, on business, on success, that I didn't see what he was going through. I thought tough love would help him. I thought pushing him harder would make him stronger. Trump's voice faltered slightly, and he pressed his lips together before continuing. But I was wrong. Fred fought his battles alone, and eventually, he lost. The crowd remained silent, hanging on his every word. A few people shifted in their seats, sensing the gravity of his confession. I lost my brother because I didn't take the time to listen, to understand what he needed, Trump said, his tone heavy with regret. And you know what? It taught me something. It taught me that no matter how much you build or achieve, there are some things you can't fix once they're gone. Some wounds don't heal just because you want them to. He looked up, his expression more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen. I don't share that story often because it's painful. But I'm sharing it now because of Lily's question. Can we fix what's broken? Sometimes we can. Sometimes we can't. But what we can do is try to be better before it's too late. We can choose to care, to listen, and to act, not tomorrow, not someday, but now. Trump's words echoed in the room, leaving a palpable sense of introspection among the audience. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by an authenticity that few had ever witnessed. He turned his gaze back to Lily, who was sitting wide-eyed, her small hands still clutching her Bible. Little moments, little choices, they matter more than you think, he said, addressing her directly. Fred's story reminds me of that every day. And maybe, if we all remember that, we can start fixing what's broken, together. The room erupted into applause, but this time, it wasn't the thunderous cheer of political fervor. It was quieter, more heartfelt, as if the crowd was moved by something deeper than rhetoric. Trump stepped back from the podium, his expression unreadable but contemplative. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the walls of division in the room had softened, if only slightly. And as Lily's gaze followed him, she felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, leaving her both humbled and inspired. As the applause died down, Lily sat motionless in her chair, her small frame barely visible among the sea of towering adults around her. Her Bible rested on her lap, her fingers tracing its leather-bound edge as her wide eyes stared at the man on stage. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she asked her question, but this raw honesty, had left her breathless. The room felt too big, too loud, and yet, somehow, incredibly intimate. She could still hear his words echoing in her mind, little moments, little choices, they matter more than you think. Lily's heart raced, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She wasn't used to seeing adults, especially someone like Donald Trump, speak with such vulnerability. It felt like he had pulled back a curtain to show her something fragile, something human. "Mom," she whispered, tugging at the sleeve of her mother's cardigan. "Do you think he really meant all of that?" Her mother, whose own eyes glistened with unshed tears, nodded slowly. "I think he did, sweetheart. That's not something you make up. He's been through pain, just like we all have." Lily glanced back at the stage. Trump had stepped away from the podium and was shaking hands with a few people in the front row, his expression a mix of solemnity and warmth. The crowd was abuzz with murmurs, the energy in the room noticeably shifted. Summoning her courage, Lily rose to her feet. Her small hands clutched the Bible tightly as she maneuvered her way through the rows of chairs. She could hear her mother calling her name softly, but she didn't stop. Something inside her told her that she needed to do this. As she approached the stage, she felt the weight of the moment press down on her, but she kept going. Finally, she stood at the edge of the platform, her voice trembling but firm. "Mr. Trump," she called out. He turned, his gaze settling on her. The crowd quieted, their murmurs fading into a collective silence. "Yes, young lady," he said, stepping closer to hear her better. Lily took a deep breath, her small voice carrying through the stillness. "I think your brother would be proud of you today. For sharing his story. For reminding us that we need to care about each other." Trump froze for a moment, his expression softening as he absorbed her words. He nodded, his voice quieter now. "Thank you, Lily. That means more to me than you know. She hesitated, then held up her Bible. I brought this because I thought you might need it. Maybe it can remind you to keep doing what you did today. To keep trying to fix things. The room seemed to hold its breath as Trump extended his hand and accepted the Bible. He looked down at it, then back at Lily, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, he said, his tone sincere. You're a remarkable young lady. As the audience erupted into a standing ovation, Lily's cheeks flushed red, but she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had done what she needed to do. And as she returned to her seat, she couldn't help but feel that something had changed, not just in the room, but in the man she had spoken to. As the applause began to settle, the atmosphere in the room shifted once again, this time to something even more profound. It was no longer just about a speech or a powerful moment shared between Donald Trump and a young girl. It became something collective, something unifying. People turned to one another, exchanging looks of quiet understanding. Strangers reached out, shaking hands, patting shoulders, and offering smiles that spoke volumes. The walls of division that had seemed so insurmountable only an hour ago now felt fragile, as though they could crumble if everyone just pushed together a little harder. Lily's small act of courage had ignited a ripple effect. Conversations sprang up in hushed tones, with voices carrying words of empathy and shared struggle. An older man in the back row, his weathered face marked by years of hardship, leaned over to the woman beside him. My brother passed away, too, he said softly, his voice trembling. I think about him every day. What Trump said, it hit close to home. Nearby, a young couple whispered to each other about their own losses, holding hands tightly as if to anchor themselves in the moment. On the stage, Trump remained still for a moment, holding the Bible Lily had given him. He seemed to be reflecting on the scene before him, his usual commanding demeanor replaced by an air of humility. Slowly, he approached the podium again, clearing his throat as the crowd quieted. I've spoken at a lot of events, he began, his voice steady but carrying a new softness, but I've never seen anything like this. Tonight, it's not about me. It's not about politics. It's about us, everyone in this room, and everyone we go home to. It's about finding ways to connect, even when it feels impossible. He paused, looking around the room, his eyes meeting those of several attendees. We all carry scars, he continued. Some of them are visible, like mine, and some of them we hide deep inside. But if tonight proves anything, it's that those scars don't have to divide us. They can remind us of what we've overcome and of the strength we have when we face them together. The audience erupted into applause once more, but this time it wasn't just for Trump or even Lily. It was for each other, for the courage to listen, to connect, and to find common ground in shared humanity. In the days and weeks that followed, stories from that evening spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with photos of Lily and her Bible, of Trump's emotional response, and of the countless small moments of connection that had happened throughout the room. Community centers reported a surge in volunteers. Churches opened their doors for grief counseling and support groups. Neighbors who had barely exchanged words in years began to check in on one another. And for Lily, life went on much the same, except it didn't. She carried with her the memory of that night, the lesson that even the smallest voice could spark change. She saw it in the way her mother smiled a little more often, in the way her neighbors waved to each other, and in the letters that arrived at their home, messages from people across the country who had been inspired by her bravery. In the end, that night was more than a moment. It was a movement, born from the courage of a little girl and the shared pain of a community ready to heal. As the evening drew to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Lily found herself standing beside her grandmother, hand in hand. Her small fingers intertwined with her grandmother's worn, calloused ones, a touch that carried generations of wisdom and strength. Her grandmother, a woman who had weathered decades of hardships, leaned down and spoke softly, her voice steady yet full of emotion. Lily, she began, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, what you did tonight, it was more than just bravery. You reminded all of us that sometimes, it takes a child's heart to see what we adults have forgotten. Lily tilted her head, her young face searching for meaning in her grandmother's words. Forgotten what? Grandma?" she asked. Her grandmother smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of both sorrow and hope. "Forgotten how to speak from the heart. How to listen to one another, not with anger or judgment, but with compassion. You reminded us that no matter how different we think we are, pain, love, and the desire for connection are what make us human." Lily nodded slowly, still trying to grasp the weight of what her grandmother was saying. She looked around at the people lingering in small groups, talking and laughing, some even wiping away tears. It was clear that something had shifted. Her grandmother continued, her voice growing stronger. "You see, my little angel, when we share our pain, it loses its power over us. It stops being something that isolates us and becomes something that binds us. That's what you gave them tonight, a chance to remember they're not alone." Lily's lips curled into a small smile, the kind that carried the innocence of a child but also the budding understanding of someone wise beyond her years. "But, Grandma," she said softly, "I was just asking a question." Her grandmother chuckled, pulling Lily into a warm embrace. "And sometimes, my dear, the simplest questions are the ones that change the world." As they walked home that night, Lily felt a new sense of pride, not because of the applause or the attention she had received, but because she understood, in her own way, that she had made a difference. And her grandmother's words stayed with her, a reminder that even the smallest gestures of kindness and courage could ripple out and touch lives in ways she might never fully see. From that day forward, Lily's story became a family legend, told and retold at gatherings, always ending with her grandmother's words, "The world doesn't need more people shouting. It needs more people like Lily, brave enough to ask the questions that matter and kind enough to listen to the answers." As the final rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the gathered crowd, the air shifted. It was no longer heavy with tension but filled with an unexpected warmth. The space, once divided by differences and disagreements, now felt unified, almost sacred. Lily's question had been the spark, but the flame had been kindled by the heartfelt stories that followed. Neighbors who had once passed each other in silence now stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing pieces of themselves they had long kept hidden. An older man with a weathered face spoke first. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't think I'd ever feel connected to anyone again. But tonight, hearing all of you, I realize I've been holding on to my pain, letting it keep me apart." His confession was met with murmurs of understanding and nods of encouragement. A young mother holding a toddler on her hip stepped forward. "I've been so scared," she admitted. "Raising my son alone, I thought no one would understand. But hearing your stories, I see now, we're all carrying something. And maybe, just maybe, we don't have to carry it alone." Applause rippled through the crowd, not loud and boisterous but gentle, like the embrace of shared empathy. Even Trump, standing off to the side, seemed moved. He cleared his throat, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his features. "You know," he began, his voice unusually soft, "I've made mistakes. A lot of them. But tonight reminds me of something my mother used to say, a broken heart doesn't mean a broken spirit. You've all reminded me of the power of resilience. Thank you." As he finished speaking, Lily's grandmother stepped forward. With her steady presence and wise eyes, she looked out over the crowd. "This moment," she said, her voice carrying with quiet authority, "is what community looks like. It's not about always agreeing. It's about showing up for each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Lily stood beside her, looking up at the faces around her. She noticed smiles where there had once been scowls, hands reaching out to clasp each other where there had once been crossed arms. She felt a swell of pride but also something deeper, a sense of belonging. And then, as if moved by an invisible rhythm, the crowd began to join hands. One by one, they reached out, creating a chain of connection that spanned the square. In that moment, words were no longer necessary. The silence was filled with something far greater, a shared understanding that, despite their differences, they were all part of the same story. The local pastor, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward and suggested a simple prayer, not for any one belief or group, but for healing and hope. Heads bowed, hearts opened, and the square became a place of unity. When the prayer ended, someone began to hum a familiar tune, and soon the crowd joined in, their voices rising in harmony. It was not perfect, but it was beautiful, a song of shared humanity, echoing into the night. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Lily felt her grandmother's hand squeeze hers. "We did something special tonight," her grandmother whispered. "And it started with you." Lily smiled, her heart full. She didn't feel like a hero, but she did feel like a part of something bigger than herself. And as she walked home, the glow of the evening lingered, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, unity could light the way. As the crowd began to disperse, the warmth of the evening still clung to the air, though the conversations around them were slowly fading into whispers. Lily stood a little apart from the others, her heart still racing from the powerful moment of unity. She glanced over at Trump, who was leaning against the wall, a contemplative look on his face. He wasn't surrounded by a crowd this time, and for a brief moment, he seemed almost lost in thought. Lily approached him cautiously, unsure of what to say after everything that had transpired. But before she could speak, he looked up, catching her gaze. "You know," Trump began, his voice quieter than usual, "I didn't expect this tonight. I thought it would be more of the same, talking past each other. But there was something different." He hesitated, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "It's funny, Lily. I've spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to make people listen, but I never really understood until tonight that sometimes, you don't have to fix anything. Sometimes, you just have to listen." Lily stood still, processing his words. She had never seen him quite like this, not the forceful figure from before, but someone who had been impacted by the very thing he often seemed to fight against, vulnerability. "I think you're right," she said softly. "I've always believed that if we could just talk about the hard things, maybe we'd understand each other better. But, maybe it's not just talking. Maybe it's about hearing each other, really hearing." Trump's expression softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he muttered, almost to himself. "That's exactly it." He paused for a long moment, as if considering something important. "You've got more power than you know, Lily. You've got the kind of strength that doesn't shout or demand, it just connects." Lily felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she quickly looked down, feeling suddenly shy. "I don't know about all that. I just wanted to help people understand that we're all in this together." Trump chuckled lightly, his usual bravado returning, though there was an unmistakable sincerity behind his voice. "That's what makes you different," he said. "You don't just talk about it. You actually make people feel it. That's what real change looks like." Lily met his gaze again, a quiet understanding passing between them. It was a moment of rare connection, one that neither of them could have predicted. "Well," Lily said, her voice steady, "I guess we both have a lot to learn. But I think we're headed in the right direction." Trump nodded, his expression now more reflective than it had been all evening. "Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe we don't have to have all the answers, but if we keep listening, maybe we'll figure it out together." Lily smiled, feeling a surge of hope rise within her. Together. That's the key. They stood there for a moment, both lost in their thoughts, the night around them quiet except for the distant sounds of people still talking, still connecting. As the last of the crowd began to trickle away, Lily turned to leave, but not before Trump spoke once more. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low and genuine. "For everything." She nodded, offering him a smile. "No, thank you. You helped make this happen." With that, they parted ways, each carrying a piece of the night with them, knowing that, in some small way, they had both been changed. And as Lily walked away, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope, a belief that, despite all the challenges ahead, there was still a chance for healing, for understanding, and for unity. As Lily walked down the quiet street, the weight of the evening's conversation settled into her thoughts. The world felt a little different now, heavier, in a way, but also lighter. She had stepped into a space of vulnerability, shared a moment with someone who, despite their differences, was just as human as she was. It wasn't the grand gesture she had imagined, but the subtle exchange of understanding, two people, meeting each other where they were, that had made all the difference. In the distance, the lights from the gathering still flickered softly, and the echoes of voices talking, laughing, and reflecting on the night hung in the air. The event wasn't just about one person or one idea, it was about a community, coming together with open hearts, willing to listen, to understand, to reach beyond what divided them. It was proof that even in the most divided times, unity was still possible. It had been messy, imperfect, but that was the beauty of it. And Lily knew, deep down, that this moment, this fleeting yet significant encounter with Trump, would stay with her. Not because it was a victory, but because it was a beginning. A small but important step in the long journey toward connection, healing, and change. When she reached her door, she paused for a moment, looking up at the sky, where stars were just beginning to twinkle through the night's veil. There was hope in the air. The world wasn't perfect, but it was full of possibility. And as long as people were willing to listen and understand, there was always the chance to make a difference. Lily smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The journey was far from over, but she wasn't walking it alone. And with that thought, she stepped inside, ready for whatever came next.